in the gleaming towers of Manhattan's Upper East Side, where fortunes are made with a single phone call and reputations crumble just as fast. There lived a man who had everything money could buy except peace of mind. His name was Harrison Blackwood, and in just 7 days he had fired 12 household staff members. Each one left his penthouse with the same expression, a mixture of relief and pity. But none of them knew what the 13th person would discover, a truth so profound it would shake the very foundation of a billionaire's carefully constructed world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Blackwood penthouse, a sprawling 15,000-square-foot domain that occupied the entire 42nd floor of the prestigious Meridian Tower. Harrison Blackwood sat alone at a dining table that could seat 20, pushing around a piece of dry toast on his plate. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft tick of a Swiss clock that cost more than most people's homes. At 53 years old, Harrison had built an empire from nothing. His hedge fund, Blackwood Capital, managed over $40 billion in assets. His face graced the covers of Forbes and Fortune. Presidents called him for advice. Yet here he sat, in a home that resembled a museum more than a residence, with no one to share his morning coffee. The penthouse was a testament to wealth without warmth. Original Rothko paintings hung on walls of imported Italian marble. Furniture custom designed by minimalist masters sat in perfect angles, rarely touched. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of Central Park, but Harrison hadn't actually looked at them in months. He moved through his palace like a ghost, haunting his own success. His routine was rigid, controlled, and utterly isolated. At precisely 5:47 a.m., he would wake without an alarm, his body trained by decades of market openings. 45 minutes of exercise in his private gym, monitoring overseas markets on 6 mounted screens. A shower in his marble bathroom, where the fixtures were plated in actual gold. Then breakfast alone while reviewing portfolios on his tablet. But lately something had shifted. The empire he'd built felt more like a prison. The routines that once brought comfort now felt like chains. And the staff, the endless parade of staff, had become intolerable. It started 3 weeks ago with Margaret, the head housekeeper who'd been with him for 2 years. He'd found her humming while arranging flowers in the library. Humming. The sound had scraped against his nerves like nails on a chalkboard. He dismissed her that afternoon with 6 months' severance and a confidentiality agreement. Then came the others. Robert, the butler, who dared to suggest that Mr. Blackwood might enjoy having dinner guests occasionally. Gone. Sandra, the chef, who'd prepared his favorite meal on his birthday without being asked. The presumption infuriated him. Fired. Thomas, the chauffeur, who'd mentioned that his daughter was graduating from Columbia, Harrison's alma mater. The personal detail felt like an invasion. Terminated. One by one, they fell like dominoes. Each dismissal came with generous compensation. Harrison wasn't cruel about money, but he was ruthless about boundaries. These people weren't family. They weren't friends. They were employees, and they'd forgotten their place. His attorney, Gerald Morrison, had called him just yesterday, concern threading through his usually professional tone. Harrison, you've gone through 12 people in 7 days. The agency is running out of candidates willing to work for you. Your reputation, my reputation, Harrison had cut him off, is built on knowing exactly what I want and accepting nothing less. Find me someone who can follow simple instructions without attempting to befriend me. The truth was more complicated than Harrison would admit, even to himself. Each friendly gesture from his staff felt like a mirror held up to his loneliness, and he couldn't bear to look. Better to maintain the fortress walls, to keep everyone at arm's length, than to acknowledge the hollow ache that had taken residence in his chest since his mother. Passed away 18 months ago, Eleanor Blackwood had been the only person who saw past his billions to the scared boy from Detroit who'd clawed his way out of poverty. She'd lived in the penthouse's guest wing until the cancer took her. After her death, Harrison had the entire wing renovated, erasing every trace of her presence because remembering hurt too much. He'd thrown himself deeper into work, made another billion, acquired another company. But the emptiness only grew. The staff had noticed, of course. They'd tried in their small ways to fill the void. A favorite dish prepared without request. A question about his day. A gentle inquiry about his well-being. Each kindness felt like an assault on the walls he'd built. So he'd responded the only way he knew how, by firing them and reinforcing the fortress. Now, as Harrison sat in his empty palace, he could hear his own breathing echo off the marble. His phone showed 37 unread messages from business associates. His calendar was packed with meetings that would move millions of dollars across global markets. But here, in this moment, in this vast and empty home, he was utterly alone. The intercom buzzed, his secretary calling from the lobby office she maintained for managing his personal affairs. "Mr. Blackwood, the agency is sending someone at 2 o'clock. They said this is their last candidate. If this doesn't work out, they won't be able to help you anymore." Harrison grunted in acknowledgement and ended the call. He didn't care about their threats. There were other agencies, other staff. The world was full of people willing to work for the salary he offered. He stood and walked to the window, finally looking out at the park below. Joggers traced paths through the green. Couples walked hand in hand. Children played on the lawns. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that 42 floors above them sat a man with everything except what mattered most, a reason to come home. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. Silver hair perfectly cut. Custom suit from Savile Row fitting his still athletic frame. Watchful grey eyes that missed nothing in a boardroom but couldn't see the prison he'd built for himself. Harrison Blackwood, master of the universe, conqueror of markets, builder of empires, stood alone in his tower, waiting for the 13th person to walk through his door, having no idea that she would be the one who refused to leave when he tried to push her away. The clock struck noon. 2 hours until his fate would change. 2 hours left in the life he'd carefully constructed. 2 hours before everything he thought he knew about power, control, and the human heart would be challenged by someone who would see past the billions to the broken man beneath. But Harrison didn't know that yet. He only knew that his toast was cold, his coffee bitter, and his home, his magnificent, expensive, empty home, had never felt more like a tomb. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The brass elevator doors opened at precisely 2 p.m., and Harrison Blackwood stood in his marble foyer, arms crossed, watching a woman step into his world. She wasn't what he expected. Sarah Mitchell was 34, dressed in a simple navy dress that had seen better days, carrying a worn leather bag that looked like it had traveled across continents. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her brown eyes met his with an unsettling directness that most people avoided in his presence. She didn't flinch under his scrutiny, didn't smile nervously, didn't attempt any of the usual pleasantries. "Mr. Blackwood," she said simply, extending her hand. "The agency sent me. He didn't take it." Instead, he began walking, expecting her to follow. "The rules are simple, Miss Mitchell. Sarah Mitchell, Miss Mitchell. You will arrive at 6 a.m. You will leave at 6 p.m. You will clean, organize, and maintain the household in complete silence. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not make eye contact. You will not prepare meals unless I specifically request them. You will not—" "No." Harrison stopped mid-stride, turning slowly. In 15 years of employing household staff, no one had ever interrupted him. "Excuse me." Sarah set her bag down on the pristine marble floor, another transgression that made his eye twitch. "I said no. I won't work under those conditions." The audacity struck him speechless for a moment. This woman, who clearly needed the job based on her threadbare coat and scuffed shoes, was refusing him. "Then you can leave the same way you came in." "I will," she said calmly, "but not before I tell you something. The agency told me about the 12 people you fired this week. They told me you're impossible, demanding, and that no one can satisfy you. They also told me you're paying triple the market rate because you're desperate. Harrison's jaw tightened. Your point? My point is that you don't need a housekeeper, Mr. Blackwood. You need a therapist. This penthouse is spotless. I can see my reflection in your floors. Your furniture looks like it's never been sat on. You're not firing people because they can't clean. You're firing them because they're human, and for some reason, that terrifies you. The words hit like physical blows. Harrison's face flushed red. Get out. Get out of my home right now. Sarah picked up her bag, but she didn't move toward the elevator. Instead, she did something that would haunt Harrison for hours afterward. She looked at him with pity. Not fear, not anger, but genuine sadness. You know what I see when I look at this place? She asked, her voice softer now. A mausoleum. You've built yourself a beautiful tomb and locked yourself inside it. Those 12 people you fired? They saw it too. They tried to bring some life into these walls, and you punished them for it. You have no idea what you're talking about, Harrison said, his voice dangerously low. You walk into my home for 5 minutes and presume to understand my life. You're right. I don't know you, but I know loneliness when I see it. I know what it looks like when someone's so afraid of being hurt that they hurt everyone else first. She paused at the elevator, pressing the call button. I lost my husband 2 years ago. Cancer. For 6 months after he died, I did what you're doing, pushed everyone away, built walls, convinced myself that if I didn't let anyone close, I couldn't lose anyone else. The elevator dinged, and Harrison realized with a start that he didn't want her to leave. Not yet. Not before he understood why this stranger's words were cutting through armor that had taken decades to build. The difference between us, Sarah continued as the doors opened, is that I eventually realized I wasn't protecting myself. I was punishing myself. I was honoring my husband's memory by refusing to live. She stepped into the elevator, then turned back. The question is, Mr. Blackwood, who are you punishing? And how long are you going to keep doing it? The doors began to close, and Harrison found himself moving forward, his hand shooting out to stop them. Wait! Sarah raised an eyebrow, waiting. The agency said you were their last candidate. Why would they send someone who would refuse the job? A small smile crossed her face, the first he'd seen. They didn't know I would. But I've learned that sometimes the only way to help someone is to show them their reflection clearly, even if they don't want to see it. Harrison stood there, his hand still holding the elevator door, his mind racing through calculations and considerations that had nothing to do with business. This woman had waltzed into his fortress, dismantled his defenses with a few well-chosen words, and was now calmly preparing to leave, as if she hadn't just turned his world upside down. What if, he started, then stopped, unsure how to continue. What if I agreed to different terms? What terms? You work here. Normal hours, normal duties, but you can speak if you have something worth saying. Sarah studied him for a long moment. Why the change of heart? Because, Harrison admitted, the words tasting foreign on his tongue, in 30 seconds you've said more truth to me than anyone has in years. And I find myself curious about what else you might say. It was the closest thing to vulnerability Harrison had allowed himself in 18 months. And it terrified him. But something about this woman, her directness, her fearlessness, her willingness to walk away from a job she clearly needed, had cracked something open inside him. Sarah stepped back out of the elevator, letting the doors close behind her. I'll work for you on one condition. Name it. You have to actually live here. Not just exist, not just sleep and eat and go through motions. Actually live. That means sitting in these expensive chairs, looking at those paintings, maybe even, heaven forbid, having a meal at that enormous dining table without staring at your phone. Harrison wanted to argue, to assert his authority, to put this presumptuous woman in her place. Instead, he found himself saying, fine. And one more thing, Sarah added, her eyes twinkling with something that might have been mischief. You have to tell me who Eleanor was. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. How do you... There's a photo in the library. It's the only personal item in this entire penthouse. An older woman looks like you holding a baby. The frame is the only thing in this place that's been touched regularly. I can see the fingerprints on the silver. Harrison's throat tightened. He wanted to fire her on the spot, to send her away for this invasion into his most private grief. But he'd made a deal, and Harrison Blackwood always honored his deals, even when they cost him more than money. "My mother," he said finally, the words barely above a whisper. "She passed away 18 months ago." Sarah's expression softened, but she didn't offer platitudes or sympathy. Instead, she simply nodded. "Then we start tomorrow at 7 a.m.? Not 6, that's barbaric. And you're going to have a proper breakfast, sitting at that table while I cook it." "Understood." Harrison almost smiled. Almost. "You're quite presumptuous, Miss Mitchell, and you're quite broken." "Mr. Blackwood, but broken things can be fixed, if we're willing to let them be." She picked up her bag again, this time heading toward the elevator with purpose. "I'll see you tomorrow." "And Mr. Blackwood?" "Yes?" "The next time someone tries to show you kindness, try not to fire them for it. It's a terrible way to go through life." The elevator doors closed, and Harrison was alone again in his pristine palace. But something had shifted. The silence didn't feel quite so oppressive. The marble didn't seem quite so cold. And for the first time in 18 months, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow. He walked back to the library, to the photograph Sarah had mentioned. His mother smiled out at him, holding him as an infant, her eyes full of the fierce love that had carried them both through poverty, through his father's abandonment, through every hardship that had shaped him into the man he'd become. "What have I done, Mom?" he whispered to the photo, his finger tracing the silver frame's edge where his touch had worn the metal smooth. "What have I become?" The photo, of course, offered no answers. But as Harrison stood there in his library, surrounded by first editions he'd never read and art he'd never truly seen, he realized that Sarah Mitchell had done something none of the others had managed. She'd made him ask questions he'd been avoiding for far too long. And tomorrow, whether he was ready or not, the answers would begin. Harrison spent the entire evening pacing his penthouse like a caged animal, second-guessing every word of his agreement with Sarah Mitchell. By midnight, he'd convinced himself to call the agency and cancel the arrangement. By 2 a.m., he'd drafted an email explaining that the position had been filled by someone else. By 4 a.m., he'd deleted both and resigned himself to seeing this through, if only to prove that he didn't need fixing. When his alarm went off at 5:47 a.m., he'd barely slept. His usual morning routine felt disrupted before it even began. Instead of his solitary workout, he found himself standing in his walk-in closet, actually considering what to wear. Not for a board meeting or a television interview, but for breakfast with his new housekeeper. The absurdity wasn't lost on him. He chose a casual shirt and slacks, then changed into a suit. Then back to casual. Finally, disgusted with his own indecision, he grabbed the first thing his hand touched and got dressed, refusing to look in the mirror. At 6:58 a.m., the intercom buzzed. Harrison stared at it as if it might explode. He considered not answering, pretending he wasn't home, letting the whole ridiculous arrangement die before it began. His finger hovered over the button for a solid 30 seconds before he finally pressed it. "Yes. Good morning, Mr. Blackwood, it's Sarah Mitchell." He wanted to say, "I've changed my mind," or "This won't work," or any of the 100 excuses he'd rehearsed. Instead, he heard himself say, "Come up." The 2 minutes it took for the elevator to reach the 42nd floor felt like an eternity. Harrison positioned himself behind the kitchen island, a power play, maintaining distance and control. He watched the elevator numbers climb: 35, 38, 40, and 42. The doors opened, and Sarah stepped out wearing jeans, a simple white blouse, and an apron folded over her arm. She carried 2 grocery bags that she set on the kitchen counter as if she owned the place. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad," she observed, unpacking fresh vegetables, eggs, and bread that looked nothing like the processed items that usually stocked his refrigerator. "I'm simply wondering what I've agreed to," Harrison replied stiffly. "Breakfast?" Sarah said simply. "Nothing more sinister than that." She began moving around his kitchen with surprising familiarity, opening drawers and cabinets with the efficiency of someone who'd worked in dozens of homes. "Though I have to say, your kitchen is criminally underused. These knives have never been properly sharpened. Your stove is practically brand new," and she opened the refrigerator. "You have nothing but protein shakes and bottled water. When was the last time you ate actual food?" "I eat," Harrison protested, though he couldn't remember his last real meal. Eating and surviving are different things. Sarah pulled out a cutting board that still had its factory sticker on it. "Sit at the table, not the counter. This is still my home, Miss Mitchell, and I'm still the person you hired to help you live in it. Sit." Harrison wanted to assert his authority, to remind her who signed the paychecks. Instead, he found himself walking to the dining table and pulling out a chair, the first time he'd sat there since his mother's death. The wood creaked slightly under his weight, and something in his chest tightened. From the kitchen, he could hear Sarah humming, the same kind of humming that had gotten Margaret fired just days ago. He opened his mouth to tell her to stop, but something made him pause. The sound wasn't intrusive or presumptuous. It was simply human, a natural expression of contentment that his home had been missing. "Your mother taught you to cook," Harrison said suddenly. Surprising himself, Sarah paused, then continued chopping. "How did you know?" "The way you move. It's not professional training, it's muscle memory from childhood." "She died when I was 16, Sarah said, her knife maintaining its steady rhythm. "Taught me everything she knew before the cancer took her. Said a woman should be able to feed herself and those she loves." Harrison absorbed this, recognizing the parallel to his own loss, even as he tried to deny its significance. "And your husband? Did you cook for him?" The knife stopped. For a moment Sarah stood perfectly still, and Harrison wondered if he'd pushed too far. Then she resumed cutting, her voice quiet but steady. "Every night for 8 years. Even when he was too sick to eat, I'd make his favorite dishes just so he could smell them. He said it reminded him of our wedding day. I'd made this ridiculous 7-course meal that was a disaster, but he'd eaten every bite and told me it was perfect." She laughed softly, a sound tinged with both joy and sorrow. "I burned the chicken, oversalted the soup, and somehow managed to make the dessert taste like soap. But he never complained. That was Daniel, always finding the good in everything. The name hung in the air between them, Daniel. A real person, a real loss, a real grief that Sarah carried with more grace than Harrison had managed with his own. "I'm sorry," Harrison said, the words feeling inadequate. "Don't be. I had 8 beautiful years with him. Some people never get that." She brought 2 plates to the table, fluffy scrambled eggs, perfectly toasted bread, and fresh tomatoes drizzled with olive oil. "Now eat. You're going to need energy for what comes next." Harrison stared at the plate. "What comes next?" "The grand tour." "Tour of what?" "Of your own home." Sarah sat across from him with her own plate, another presumption that should have irritated him but somehow didn't. "You're going to show me every room. And tell me what it's for, and explain why you've spent millions on spaces you never use." "That's ridiculous. I know my own home. Do you? When's the last time you stepped foot in that sunroom? Or used that state-of-the-art gym equipment? Or sat in that library and actually read one of those first editions?" Harrison picked up his fork, more to avoid answering than from hunger. But the moment the eggs touched his tongue, something shifted. They were perfect. Creamy, seasoned with herbs he couldn't name. Nothing like the protein shakes and energy bars that constituted his usual breakfast. "The gym has exercise equipment I use daily," he said defensively. 6 treadmills and 4 ellipticals, according to the agency's file. "Do you really need that many to run in place?" Despite himself, Harrison almost smiled. "They're different models, different features. Or," Sarah countered, "there's 6 ways to avoid actually going anywhere." The observation cut deeper than she probably intended. Harrison set down his fork, his appetite suddenly gone despite the excellent food. "You don't know anything about my life." "You're right. I don't, but I know avoidance when I see it. I know what it looks like when someone fills their life with things instead of people. I know." "Enough." Harrison stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. "I hired you to maintain my home, not psychoanalyze me over breakfast." Sarah remained seated, calmly cutting her toast. "You hired me to help you live here. That's what I'm doing. By insulting my choices? By making assumptions about my life? By holding up a mirror you've been avoiding for 18 months. Harrison wanted to fire her. The words were right there, the same words he'd used 12 times in the past week. But something stopped him. Perhaps Sarah's unwavering calm, perhaps the truth in her observations, perhaps the simple fact that she'd made him sit at his table and eat a real meal for the first time in months. "I don't need this," he said. But the conviction in his voice had weakened. "No, you don't need this. You've managed perfectly well turning your home into a showroom and your life into a schedule. But is that really living, Mr. Blackwood? Or is it just existing with expensive furniture?" Harrison turned to the window, staring out at Central Park below. A jogger ran the reservoir path, the same path his mother used to walk every morning. He'd scattered her ashes there, in the Shakespeare garden she loved, under the cover of darkness, because the thought of doing it in daylight, with witnesses, had been unbearable. "She used to make me breakfast," Harrison heard himself say, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every Sunday morning, no matter how busy I was, she'd insist." Said a man who couldn't take time for a proper breakfast was a man who'd forgotten how to be human. He could feel Sarah's presence behind him. Though she hadn't moved from the table, the Sunday after her funeral, he continued, "I came down here out of habit, set 2 places, made coffee the way she liked it. Then I realized she was gone, and I'd never have Sunday breakfast again. I threw everything away, the cups, the plates, even the coffee maker. Anything that reminded me of those mornings. And you've been eating alone ever since," Sarah said softly. "It's easier. Easier isn't the same as better." Harrison turned back to face her, and for the first time he truly looked at this woman who'd invaded his carefully constructed isolation. She wasn't trying to fix him or change him or make him into something he wasn't. She was simply refusing to let him hide. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. The confession costing him more than any business deal ever had. "Do what?" Any of this. I've spent my entire adult life building walls, maintaining distance, staying in control. And now you're here, asking me to tear it all down, and I don't know if I can." Sarah stood, picking up both plates. "I'm not asking you to tear anything down, Mr. Blackwood. I'm just asking you to open a window, let some air in, see what happens." She walked back to the kitchen, and Harrison found himself following, another small surrender in what felt like a war he was losing without ever quite knowing how the battle had begun. "The tour starts in 10 minutes, Sarah announced, washing dishes in a sink that had never seen use. "And this time, when I ask you about a room, I want the truth, not the designer's description or the insurance value, but why you chose it and what you hoped it would mean. This is absurd." "Yes," Sarah agreed cheerfully, "but you're still going to do it, aren't you?" Harrison opened his mouth to refuse, to reassert his control, to end this entire arrangement before it went any further. But then he looked around his pristine kitchen, smelled the lingering scent of real food, and remembered what it felt like to sit at a table meant for sharing. 10 minutes, he conceded, walking toward his study where he could regroup, reconsider, and remind himself why this was all a terrible mistake. Behind him, Sarah resumed her humming, and this time Harrison didn't tell her to stop. It was a small thing, that allowance. But as he would learn in the days to come, the smallest cracks in the strongest walls often led to the most profound transformations. He just didn't know it yet. 3 days had passed since Sarah's arrival, and Harrison's carefully ordered world was showing cracks he couldn't patch fast enough. The grand tour she'd insisted upon had turned into a daily ritual. each morning. They'd tackle a different wing of the penthouse, and each morning, Sarah would ask questions that stripped away his defenses, layer by layer. Thursday morning found them standing in the music room, a space Harrison hadn't entered in over a year. A Steinway grand piano sat in the center, its black lacquer surface reflecting the morning light. Original sheet music in glass frames lined the walls, each piece worth thousands of dollars, none of them ever played. "My mother chose this room," Harrison said before Sarah could ask. His new habit of preemptive honesty still felt foreign on his tongue. "She said every home needed music. Did she play?" Sarah ran her fingers along the piano's closed lid, leaving trails in the dust that made Harrison wince. "No, she couldn't afford lessons as a child, and by the time I could afford to give them to her, her arthritis was too severe." He walked to the window, unable to look at the instrument. "I bought her this piano anyway. Heard the best teacher in New York. She'd sit right there every Tuesday afternoon, trying to make her fingers cooperate with the keys." "What did she play?" "Chopsticks," Harrison laughed, a sound so unexpected it surprised them both. 6 months of lessons with a Manhattan conservatory professor, and all she ever mastered was chopsticks. She'd play it over and over, laughing at herself, saying that at least she'd die knowing one song perfectly. Sarah opened the piano lid, revealing pristine ivory keys. "Play it for her." "What?" "Chopsticks." "Play it. I don't know how. I never learned." "Then it's time you did." Sarah sat on the bench, patting the space beside her. "Come on, it's the easiest song in the world. If Eleanor could learn it with arthritis, surely Harrison Blackwood can manage." For a moment, Harrison considered refusing. Then he thought about his mother's laughter, the way she'd transform her frustration into joy, her insistence that trying mattered more than succeeding. He sat beside Sarah, their shoulders nearly touching, the closest he'd been to another person in months. "Pointer fingers only," Sarah instructed, demonstrating the simple pattern. "See? Nothing to it." Harrison placed his fingers on the keys, feeling foolish and exposed. When he pressed down, the notes came out hesitant, clumsy. Sarah joined in, her fingers dancing alongside his. And suddenly, the music room was filled with the simplest melody in the world. The same one his mother had played hundreds of times. "She'd be proud," Sarah said softly as they finished. "She'd be laughing at how terrible I am." "Same thing." "Really?" Something shifted in Harrison that morning. A decision formed, gradual but definitive, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe existing wasn't the same as living. Maybe it was time to try something different. That afternoon, he cancelled a meeting, the first time in his career he'd done so for anything other than another business obligation. He found Sarah in the library, alphabetizing books that had been arranged by color at the designer's insistence. "I want to invite someone to dinner," he announced. Sarah looked up from her work, surprise evident on her face. "Who?" "Gerald Morrison, my attorney. He's been—" Harrison paused, searching for the right words. "He's been trying to get me to have dinner with him and his wife for 3 years. What changed?" "You asked me yesterday why I have a dining table that seats 20, but each standing at the kitchen counter. I didn't have an answer. I'd like to have one." Sarah set down the book she was holding. "When? Tomorrow, Friday. Is that enough time? To prepare dinner for 3 people?" Sarah smiled. "Mr. Blackwood, I could prepare dinner for 30 with less notice. The question is, are you ready?" Harrison considered this. Was he ready to let someone into his fortress? To sit across from another human being and attempt conversation that wasn't about profit margins or acquisition strategies? The thought terrified him, but so did the alternative. Another year of isolation, another 1,000 meals eaten alone, another day pretending that his empire was enough. "No," he admitted, "but I'm going to do it anyway." The next 24 hours became a whirlwind of activity. Sarah transformed the dining room from a museum piece into an actual space for gathering. She removed the crystal centerpiece that blocked sightlines, replaced the stiff formal linens with simpler elegance, adjusted the lighting from stark to warm. Harrison watched her work, occasionally offering opinions she'd promptly ignore. and discovered he didn't mind her quiet authority in transforming his space. He called Gerald himself. No assistant, no formal invitation. The shock in his old friend's voice was almost comical. "Harrison, is everything all right? You never call directly unless—" "Everything's fine, Gerald. I'm calling to invite you and Patricia to dinner tomorrow evening. 7 o'clock, silence. Then dinner? At your home? Is that so surprising? Harrison, you've turned down every invitation for the past 18 months. Yes, it's surprising. It's miraculous. Patricia won't believe me when I tell her. Just come. Gerald and—" Harrison paused, feeling vulnerable again. "Maybe don't make a big production of it. Just come." The day of the dinner, Harrison found himself anxious in ways that billion-dollar deals never made him. He changed clothes 4 times. He rehearsed conversation topics. He nearly called to cancel 3 separate times. Sarah watched his spiral with patient amusement. "You're having dinner, not negotiating a hostile takeover," she reminded him as he stood paralyzed in front of his closet for the 4th time. "I haven't entertained in my home since Eleanor passed." "I know." Sarah appeared in his doorway holding a simple blue shirt. "Wear this. It makes you look human instead of like you're about to fire someone." Harrison took the shirt, then surprised himself by asking, "Will you stay for dinner?" Sarah shook her head. "This is your step to take, not mine. I'll prepare everything, then I'll leave. You need to do this on your own." "I don't know if I can." "Yes, you can. Because you've already done the hardest part, which is, you asked." At 6:30, Sarah put the final touches on a meal that made the penthouse smell like a home for the first time in Harrison's memory. Roasted chicken with herbs, vegetables that looked nothing like the processed items from his usual delivery service, bread that she'd somehow baked in his unused oven. "The chicken needs to rest for 10 minutes before you carve it," she instructed, removing her apron. "The wine is breathing on the sideboard, a Bordeaux, since Gerald mentioned it's his favorite when you talked to him about that merger last year." Harrison stared at her. "How did you know that?" "You mentioned it yesterday. You said Gerald got sentimental about a wine you served at a business dinner 5 years ago." Sarah smiled. "I pay attention, Mr. Blackwood. It's my job. This goes far beyond your job description. Maybe helping people reconnect with their lives is exactly what my job should be." She grabbed her coat from the hall closet. "I'll be back Monday morning. Try to actually enjoy yourself tonight. It won't kill you." After she left, Harrison stood alone in his penthouse, and for the first time, the solitude felt different. Not permanent, but temporary. A brief quiet before the company arrived. He walked through the dining room one last time, adjusting a fork that didn't need adjusting, moving a glass an inch to the left. The table looked beautiful. The food smelled incredible. His home, for one evening, would have life in it beyond his own hollow existence. At precisely 7 o'clock, the intercom buzzed. "Mr. Blackwood, Gerald and Patricia Morrison are here." Harrison took a deep breath, his hand shaking slightly as he pressed the button. "Send them up." In the elevator's ascent, 30 seconds, 40 floors, Harrison made a choice. Not a business decision with calculated risks and projected outcomes, but a human choice. He would open his door. He would welcome his friends. He would sit at his mother's table and share a meal like a normal person, even if it terrified him. The elevator dinged. The doors opened. Gerald stepped out first, Patricia behind him, both dressed nicely but not formally, both wearing expressions of wonder mixed with concern. "Harrison," Gerald said carefully, as if approaching a skittish animal. "Thank you for inviting us." Harrison stepped forward, and instead of his usual curt handshake, he pulled Gerald into a brief embrace, awkward, unpracticed, but genuine. Patricia's eyes widened in surprise. "Thank you for coming," Harrison said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite suppress. I've been meaning to do this for a while." 18 months is quite a while," Patricia said gently, then smiled. "But we're here now, and something smells absolutely wonderful." As Harrison led them to the dining room, showing them to their seats, pouring wine with slightly unsteady hands, he felt something he hadn't experienced in nearly 2 years. Hope. Not the hope of a successful quarter or a profitable merger, but the simple human hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to living, to new beginnings. Gerald raised his glass, understanding in his eyes. To new beginnings, Harrison echoed, and for the first time in forever he meant it. The evening unfolded with surprising ease. They talked about everything except business. Patricia's garden, Gerald's attempts at learning golf, memories of Eleanor that made them laugh rather than cry. Harrison found himself relaxing, the conversation flowing naturally. Once he stopped trying to control it, as dessert was served, a simple apple tart Sarah had left warming in the oven, Patricia reached across the table and squeezed Harrison's hand. "We've missed you," she said simply. 3 words. That's all it took. 3 words to crack the final wall around Harrison's heart. He squeezed back, unable to speak past the lump in his throat, but managing a nod that said everything he couldn't, when Gerald and Patricia left at 11. With promises to do this again soon, Harrison stood in his doorway long after the elevator doors closed. The penthouse was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. The ghosts had been exorcised not by forgetting, but by remembering how to live alongside the memories. He walked back to the dining room, surveying the remnants of the evening, used plates, wine glasses with lipstick marks, crumbs on the tablecloth. Normally the mess would have sent him into a cleaning frenzy. Tonight he left it all, wanting to preserve the evidence that life had happened here. In the music room, he sat at the piano alone. His fingers found the keys, and slowly, haltingly, he played chopsticks in the empty room. Somewhere, he imagined, his mother was laughing, and for the first time since her death, Harrison laughed with her. Monday morning arrived with unexpected sunshine streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Harrison woke at his usual 5:47, but instead of immediately checking the Asian markets, he lay in bed for an extra 10 minutes, a small rebellion that felt monumental. When he finally rose, he found himself walking to the music room first, playing those simple chopsticks notes that had become his morning meditation. Sarah arrived at 7, carrying a canvas bag filled with what looked like art supplies. "What's all this?" Harrison asked, eyeing the bag suspiciously as she set it on the kitchen counter. "Today's lesson," she replied, pulling out sketch pads, charcoal pencils, and watercolors. "You're going to learn to see your own home." "I see it perfectly fine." "No, you see dollar amounts and square footage. When's the last time you actually looked at that Rothko in your living room and felt something?" Harrison bristled. "I bought it because I appreciate abstract expressionism. You bought it because your art consultant said it was a sound investment." Sarah handed him a sketch pad. "Today, we're going to sit in front of it, and you're going to draw what you feel when you look at it." "This is ridiculous. I have a conference call at 9. Cancel it. I can't just—" "Yes, you can. You're Harrison Blackwood. You can do whatever you want. The question is whether you're brave enough to want something different than you've always wanted." That stung, primarily because it was true. Harrison had spent decades doing what was expected, what was profitable, what made sense. The idea of sitting on his own floor with a sketchpad, trying to capture feelings rather than figures, seemed absurd. He cancelled the meeting. An hour later, he sat cross-legged on his pristine white carpet, a position he hadn't assumed since childhood, staring at the Rothko while Sarah worked nearby, her own sketch capturing the play of light through the windows. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel," Harrison admitted, his charcoal hovering uselessly over blank paper. "Then draw that. Draw the emptiness. Draw the confusion. Draw the fact that you spent $2 million on something you've never really looked at." Harrison's hand moved almost without conscious thought, creating dark, heavy lines that filled the page. Not the Rothko's floating rectangles of color, but something else. Bars, a cage, a prison of his own making. When he finished, he stared at what he'd created with something close to horror. "Well," Sarah said, looking over his shoulder, "that's honest." The days that followed brought more lessons that had nothing to do with maintaining a household and everything to do with reclaiming a life. Sarah taught him to cook, not just follow recipes, but to taste, adjust, create. His first attempt at her mother's pasta sauce was a disaster that they ended up ordering pizza to replace, but they laughed over the failure instead of dwelling on it. She showed him how to really use his gym, not as a place to punish his body, while watching stock tickers, but as a space to feel strong, alive. They played actual games on the tennis court on his rooftop, keeping score with shouted numbers and disputes over line calls that would have seemed undignified to the old Harrison. "You're cheating," he accused after her fourth ace. "I'm winning," she corrected, grinning. "There's a difference. That ball was out. Your eyesight is terrible. Maybe you should try enjoying the game instead of officiating it." Harrison served with more force than necessary, the ball sailing past her. "Like that? Now you're getting it." But the real learning came in quieter moments. Like the afternoon she found him in his home office, surrounded by monitors displaying red numbers as the market dipped. "You're going to give yourself a heart attack," Sarah observed, setting down a cup of tea he hadn't asked for, but discovered he needed. "I've lost $300 million today, and you'll make it back tomorrow. You always do." She perched on the edge of his desk, something that would have infuriated him weeks ago. "But here's a question. What would you do if you couldn't make it back?" "That's not going to happen." "But if it did? If tomorrow you woke up and all of this was gone, the money, the penthouse, the empire, what would you do?" Harrison opened his mouth to dismiss the question, then stopped. What would he do? For the first time in his adult life, he didn't have an immediate answer. His entire identity was built on accumulation, on winning, on having more than anyone else. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "Then maybe it's time to figure that out." Sarah stood, heading for the door. "Come on, the sun's setting, and you've never actually watched it from your terrace." "I've seen sunsets before. Have you? Or have you just glanced at them between emails?" They stood on the terrace as the sky turned gold and pink over Central Park. Harrison tried to remember the last time he'd done nothing but watch the day end, and couldn't. The city spread out before them, millions of lives playing out in the growing darkness, each one as real and complex as his own. "My husband used to say that every sunset was proof that endings could be beautiful," Sarah said softly. "That every day got a standing ovation from the sky." He sounds like he was quite philosophical. He was a high school English teacher who made terrible puns and cried at commercials, but he knew how to find beauty in ordinary moments. She turned to Harrison, the fading light catching her profile. "You know what he'd say about you? I can't imagine. That you were so busy collecting trophies, you forgot you were already enough." The words hung in the air between them as darkness settled over the city. Harrison wanted to argue, to defend himself, to explain that nothing he'd achieved had ever felt like enough because he'd started with nothing. But Sarah's gentle observation had found its mark. "How do I learn that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do I learn to feel like enough? One moment at a time. One sunset, one badly cooked meal, one terrible drawing," she smiled. "You're already doing it, you know. You're just too stubborn to notice." The following week brought small victories and spectacular failures. Harrison burned toast but successfully flipped an omelette. He attempted watercolors and created something that looked like a child's finger painting. But when Sarah hung it on the refrigerator with a magnet, he found himself strangely proud. He invited Gerald and Patricia back, this time cooking the meal himself, a simple roast that was overdone but eaten with genuine appreciation. "This is incredible, Harrison." Patricia lied kindly, cutting around the toughest bits. "It's terrible," he corrected, "but I made it myself, and somehow that makes it taste better." Gerald nearly choked on his wine. "Who are you and what have you done with Harrison Blackwood?" But perhaps the biggest shift came on Thursday afternoon when Harrison's assistant called about an emergency board meeting. A hostile takeover attempt, a crisis that demanded his immediate attention, the kind of corporate warfare he'd always thrived on. "Tell them I'll be there in an hour," Harrison said, then paused. Sarah was in the kitchen teaching him to make bread, something about kneading being therapeutic. The dough was just reaching the right consistency, and if he left now, he'd miss the crucial next steps. "Actually," he said slowly, "tell them I'll join by video conference. I'm in the middle of something important." His assistant's confusion was palpable. "But Mr. Blackwood, this is the Chen Group acquisition. You've been working on this for 6 months, and I can work on it from here. Set up the video link." He hung up and returned to the kitchen, where Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine. I'm just learning that being present here is sometimes more important than being there." He plunged his hands back into the dough, feeling its resistance, its potential. "Besides, this is my first attempt at bread. I'm not giving up now." The board meeting happened with Harrison's face on a screen, flour on his shirt, the sounds of a home actually being lived inaudible in the background. He negotiated the deal brilliantly, but for the first time, he did it from a place of confidence rather than compulsion. He didn't need this victory to prove his worth. He was already enough. When the call ended with a successful outcome, Sarah had the bread in the oven, filling the penthouse with a smell that no amount of money could buy, the scent of something created with his own hands. "How does it feel?" she asked, balancing both worlds. Harrison considered this, watching through the oven window as his bread slowly turned golden. "Terrifying, exhilarating, like learning to walk on a tightrope without a net. But you're walking, I'm stumbling. There's a difference. Not as much as you think." Sarah handed him a towel to wipe the flour from his hands. "Every expert was once a beginner. Every master once felt like a fool. The only difference is they kept going. The bread came out imperfect, too dense in the middle, too crusty on the edges. But when Harrison tore off a piece and tasted it, still warm from the oven, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Pride, not in a billion-dollar deal or a market victory, but in something simple, human, real. "It's not very good," he observed. "It's wonderful," Sarah corrected. "Because you made it. Because you tried. Because you're learning that life isn't about perfection. It's about participation." That night, Harrison sat at his piano and played more than chopsticks. He stumbled through "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," his fingers clumsy on keys his mother had once struggled with. But he played with the lights of Manhattan, twinkling beyond his windows, in a home that finally felt lived in, learning that perhaps the greatest fortune wasn't what you accumulated, but what you allowed yourself to experience. Sarah had been right. He was learning to live, to feel, to be present in his own extraordinary, ordinary life. And while he still had mountains to climb and walls to tear down, for the first time in 18 months, maybe in his entire adult life, Harrison Blackwood felt like he was heading in the right direction, even if he occasionally got lost along the way. It started with a phone call at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday that shattered the fragile peace Harrison had been building. The Shanghai Exchange had opened to chaos. One of his largest investments, a tech company he'd poured billions into, had just announced massive fraud. The CEO was under arrest. The stock was in freefall. Harrison's fund stood to lose everything. He was at his computer before he was fully awake, watching the numbers cascade downward like a digital avalanche. Red everywhere, hundreds of millions evaporating with each refresh. His hands shook as he dialed his senior analyst in Hong Kong. "How bad?" he demanded. "Catastrophic, sir. We're looking at potential losses of 8 billion. Maybe more when the New York markets open. 8 billion. The number echoed in Harrison's mind as he ended the call. Not his entire fortune, but enough to wound him deeply. Enough to trigger every survival instinct he'd developed crawling out of Detroit's poverty. Enough to remind him why he'd built those walls in the first place, because the world was brutal. And trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. He spent the next 72 hours in his office, barely sleeping, surviving on coffee and adrenaline. The old Harrison Blackwood roared back to life, cold, calculating, ruthless. He fired 3 analysts for missing the warning signs, screamed at his legal team for their incompetence, tore through his portfolio like a hurricane, liquidating positions, calling in favors, playing every angle to minimize the damage. Sarah tried to bring him food. He waved her away without looking up. "Mr. Blackwood, you need to eat something. What I need is for you to leave me alone. This is exactly why I don't have time for your touchy-feely nonsense. The real world doesn't care about sunsets and homemade bread. It eats people like you for breakfast." She left the plate and retreated. He didn't notice. By Friday, he'd managed to reduce the losses to $6 billion through aggressive trading and some creative financial maneuvering that skirted ethical lines he'd once promised himself he wouldn't cross. But the victory felt hollow, tainted by the methods he'd used and the person he'd become again in the process. Gerald called, worried. "Harrison, I heard about the Shanghai situation. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine. I've handled worse. That's not what I meant. I meant you. How are you doing?" "There is no me separate from this, Gerald. This is who I am. This is what I do." Harrison's voice was ice. Everything else was just pretending. When he finally emerged from his office on Saturday afternoon, the penthouse felt different. Sarah had clearly been there. Fresh flowers in vases, meals prepared and stored in the refrigerator, books left open with marked passages about resilience and recovery. But she wasn't there. For the first time since she'd started, she hadn't come at her usual hour. Harrison told himself he was relieved. He didn't need her pity, her gentle pushing, her insistence that he could be something other than what he was. The crisis had reminded him of reality. He was a shark in an ocean of sharks, and the moment you showed weakness, they devoured you. He called the agency. "Miss Mitchell won't be returning. Send someone else Monday. Someone who understands professional boundaries." But when Monday arrived, Harrison found himself unable to work. He wandered the penthouse like a ghost, each room a reminder of what he'd almost allowed himself to believe. The piano sat silent. The bread maker Sarah had ordered gathered dust. The sketchpad, with his crude drawings, felt like evidence of temporary insanity. The new housekeeper arrived, an older woman named Mrs. Chen, who was perfectly professional, perfectly quiet, perfectly forgettable. She cleaned around him as if he didn't exist, exactly as he'd once demanded. It should have been perfect. It was unbearable. Tuesday brought worse news. 3 major clients were pulling their investments, spooked by the Shanghai losses. Word was spreading that Harrison had lost his edge, that age and isolation had dulled his instincts. Competitors circled like vultures. A hostile board member called for his removal as CEO. "You've become erratic," Marcus Webb, his longtime rival, announced during an emergency board meeting. "Making decisions from your apartment, joining calls with flour on your shirt, prioritizing personal matters over billion-dollar deals. The Harrison Blackwood I knew would never have allowed this disaster to happen." Harrison wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Because Marcus was right, wasn't he? The old Harrison, the one who lived at the office, who treated relationships as transactions, who never let his guard down. That Harrison would have seen the Shanghai fraud coming. That Harrison would have been 3 steps ahead, instead of caught flat-footed while playing piano and making bread. That night, he stood in his penthouse as darkness fell over Manhattan, and for the first time since his mother's death, Harrison Blackwood seriously considered whether it was all worth it, not in a dramatic, dangerous way, but in the quiet desperation of someone who'd glimpsed something better, only to have it ripped away. His phone rang. Sarah's number. He stared at it for 4 rings before answering. "Mr. Blackwood?" "It's Sarah. I know. I have caller ID." A pause. "I heard about what happened. I wanted to check on you. I'm fine. Everything's under control." "Is it?" "Because Gerald's worried. Patricia called me. She got my number from the agency. She said you fired everyone again and locked yourself away. This is none of your concern anymore, Miss Mitchell. I terminated your employment. You fired me because I saw you struggling and you couldn't handle someone witnessing your vulnerability." Her voice was gentle but firm. "It's what you do, Harrison. When things get hard, you push everyone away and tell yourself you're better off alone. Maybe I am." "No, you're not. You're just scared. And I understand that. God knows I understand that. When Daniel died, I pushed everyone away too. I fired my grief counselor, stopped seeing friends, convinced myself that isolation was protection. But it wasn't protection, Harrison. It was just another kind of death." Harrison sank into a chair, the fight draining out of him. "I lost $8 billion, Sarah. I missed the warning signs because I was distracted, playing at being normal, pretending I could be something I'm not. People are losing their jobs because I wanted to learn to make bread. People lost money because criminals committed fraud. You're taking responsibility for things beyond your control, just like you're taking credit for successes that involve luck and timing." She paused. "The real question is, what kind of man do you want to be when you rebuild? Because you will rebuild. You always do. But will you rebuild the same prison you've been living in, or will you build something different? I don't know if I can do different. This crisis proved that. This crisis proved you're human, that you can be hurt, that you care about things beyond profit margins." Her voice softened. "Come to dinner tomorrow night. My apartment. Nothing fancy, just food and conversation. Let someone care about you without pushing them away. Sarah, 7 o'clock. 443 West 23rd Street, apartment 5C. If you don't show up, I'll understand. But I hope you do, because the man who played chopsticks for his mother's memory deserves better than dying alone in a golden cage." She hung up before he could refuse. Harrison sat in the dark, watching the city lights blur through unexpected tears. The penthouse felt enormous around him, all 15,000 square feet of expensive emptiness. Mrs. Chen had cleaned and left without a word, exactly as instructed. The silence was perfect, complete, suffocating. He picked up his phone, scrolling through messages from board members demanding decisions, analysts requesting guidance, lawyers needing signatures. All of it urgent, all of it important, all of it meaningless, in the face of the simple question Sarah had asked. What kind of man did he want to be? For 48 hours he'd been the old Harrison, calculating, cold, effective. He'd minimized financial damage while maximizing emotional destruction. He'd protected his empire while demolishing the small, fragile piece he'd been building. And now he sat in the wreckage, victorious and utterly defeated, his mother's photo watched from the library shelf. He could almost hear her voice. "Baby, you can make all the money in the world, but you can't buy back wasted time. You can't invest in what matters when you're gone." Wednesday morning arrived grey and cold. Harrison dressed in his armor, custom suit, silk tie, Italian shoes. He looked every inch the billionaire, the master of the universe, the man who'd built an empire from nothing. But when he looked in the mirror, he saw someone else. A scared boy from Detroit who'd confused accumulation with achievement, who'd built walls so high he couldn't see the sky. The decision crystallized with sudden clarity. He could rebuild his empire. He could win back every dollar, crush every competitor, prove Marcus Webb wrong. He'd done it before. He could do it again, but he couldn't do it alone anymore. And more importantly, he didn't want to. At 6:45 p.m., Harrison stood outside a modest apartment building in Chelsea, holding a bottle of wine that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His car idled at the curb, driver waiting for orders to flee. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to return to his fortress, to rebuild his walls higher than before. Instead, he pressed the buzzer for apartment 5C. "Hello?" Sarah's voice crackled through the intercom. "It's Harrison." I'm here," a pause that felt eternal. Then, "Come on up." As he climbed the 5 flights, the elevator was broken. Harrison realized he was more terrified than he'd been facing any boardroom battle. Because this wasn't about winning or losing. This was about showing up, being present, allowing himself to be seen in his brokenness. Sarah opened the door before he could knock, wearing jeans and a simple sweater. Her apartment small and warm and filled with the smell of something cooking that made his empty penthouse feel even more hollow in memory. "You came," she said, and the relief in her voice nearly undid him. "I almost didn't, but you did. That's what matters." She stepped aside. "Come in. Dinner's almost ready and I want to hear everything. Not about the billions lost, or the board meetings, or the damage control. I want to hear about how you're really doing." Harrison stepped across the threshold into a space smaller than his walk-in closet, but infinitely richer in the ways that mattered. And for the first time since the crisis began, he allowed himself to fall apart, knowing someone would be there to help him pick up the pieces. The darkest moment had arrived. But as Sarah closed the door behind him, Harrison realized that sometimes you had to completely break down before you could truly break through. Sarah's apartment was a revelation. Where Harrison's penthouse sprawled in clinical perfection, her modest one-bedroom overflowed with life. Plants crowded windowsills, photographs covered every surface, books spilled from shelves onto floors. A worn couch bore the impression of countless evenings spent reading. The kitchen table, barely large enough for two, held mismatched placemats and candles burned down to nubs. "It's not much," Sarah said, taking his coat, "but it's home." Harrison stood frozen in her living room, overwhelmed by the intimacy of it all. Every object told a story. A chipped mug that read, "World's best teacher," that must have been Daniel's. A blanket thrown over the couch that showed signs of being clutched during difficult nights. A recipe box with handwritten cards in what must have been her mother's elegant script. "Sit." Sarah gestured to the table where two plates waited. "I made my mother's chicken soup. Nothing fancy, but it's what she made whenever life got hard." As Harrison sat in the rickety chair, something inside him cracked wide open. The smell of the soup, the warmth of the small space, the gentle clatter of Sarah ladling portions. It was everything his penthouse wasn't. Real, lived in, loved. "I fired everyone again," he said quietly as she sat across from him. "Pushed them all away the moment things got difficult." "I know, you were right. About everything. I built a tomb and called it a home. I measured my worth in billions while ignoring everything that actually mattered." Sarah reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. The simple gesture of human contact nearly broke him. "The Shanghai disaster wasn't your fault, Harrison. But how you respond to it, that's your choice. You can retreat back into isolation, or you can use this as a catalyst for real change. I don't know how to change. Every instinct tells me to rebuild the walls, work harder, prove everyone wrong. Then you'll be right back where you started, successful and miserable." She squeezed his hand. "What if instead of proving everyone wrong, you prove yourself right? Right that you deserve connection, right that you're more than your bank balance, right that Eleanor's son is still in there somewhere, worth loving just for being himself." Harrison's eyes burned. "What if I fail? What if I try to be different and I'm still just empty? Then you fail with people who care about you, instead of succeeding alone in the dark." Sarah stood, moving around the table to kneel beside his chair. "Harrison, you've spent your whole life afraid of becoming that poor boy from Detroit again. But what if that boy had something the billionaire lost? What if he knew how to dream, how to hope, how to love without calculating the return on investment?" The tears came then. 18 months of grief, decades of loneliness, a lifetime of fear that no amount of money could ever fill the hole his father's abandonment had left. Sarah held him as he sobbed, this woman who'd lost everything herself, yet somehow still had the courage to open her heart again. "I'm so tired," Harrison whispered against her shoulder. "Tired of being strong, tired of winning, tired of pretending I don't need anyone. Then stop pretending. Be tired, be weak, be human." Sarah pulled back, looking into his eyes. "You know what Daniel told me the week before he died? He said that the bravest thing we ever do is let people see us as we really are. Not our accomplishments or our failures, but our actual selves." Harrison nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. They sat in silence, eating soup that tasted like comfort, like home, like everything he'd been missing without knowing it. I want to try again, he said finally. Not just with you, but with everything. I want to learn how to live in my home instead of haunting it. I want to stop measuring my worth in market fluctuations. He paused, the words difficult but necessary. I want to be the man my mother believed I could be. Sarah smiled, tears in her own eyes. Then that's what we'll do. But Harrison, this time no firing me when things get hard. No pushing away when you're scared. If we do this, we do it honestly. Deal. He managed a weak smile. Though I should warn you, I'm probably going to mess up. A lot. I'm counting on it. Perfect people are boring. They spent the rest of the evening talking, really talking. About childhood dreams and adult regrets. About Daniel and Eleanor. About the people they'd been and the people they wanted to become. Harrison learned that Sarah had been a nurse before Daniel got sick. That she'd given up her career to care for him. That she'd been working as a housekeeper to rebuild her savings while figuring out her next chapter. What do you want to do? Harrison asked. Long term, I mean. I want to help people, Sarah said simply. Not just clean their houses, but actually help them live better lives. Maybe start a service that pairs caregivers with people who are lonely or struggling. Something meaningful. I could fund that, Harrison offered immediately. No, Sarah's voice was firm. That's you trying to solve problems with money instead of presence. If I start something, I'll do it myself. You can cheer me on, maybe offer advice, but no checkbook solutions. Harrison laughed, genuinely laughed for the first time in weeks. You're incredibly stubborn, says the man who fired 12 people in 1 week because they tried to be nice to him. At midnight, Harrison called his driver to take him home. At the door, he hesitated, then pulled Sarah into a hug, awkward but heartfelt. Thank you, he whispered, for not giving up on me. Thank you for finally showing up for yourself. The ride back to his penthouse felt different. The city lights didn't seem cold anymore, just alive with possibility. When he arrived home, Mrs. Chen had left everything spotless and soulless. Harrison looked around his marble palace and knew what he had to do. The next morning, he called an emergency board meeting, but not the one they expected. I'm stepping back, he announced to the shocked faces on the video screen. Not permanently, but I'm delegating day-to-day operations. I've been so focused on building this empire that I forgot why I built it in the first place. Marcus Webb's face reddened. You're abandoning ship during a crisis? No, I'm ensuring this ship has a crew that can sail without me micromanaging every decision. I've hired the best people in the industry. It's time I trusted them to do their jobs. Harrison's voice was steady, certain. And it's time I learned to do mine, which isn't just making money, but making a life worth living. The vote was close, but Harrison retained control. Several board members resigned in protest. Let them. For the first time in his career, Harrison wasn't driven by fear of loss, but by hope for gain, not financial gain, but the wealth of authentic living. He called Sarah. I'm keeping you on, but with a new job description. Oh? What's that? Life coach, friend, someone who keeps me honest when I start building walls again. I don't need a fancy title, Harrison, and I definitely don't want a ridiculous salary. Too bad. Consider it hazard pay for dealing with my nonsense. He paused. Also, I'm turning the East Wing into something useful. A community space. Somewhere people who are lonely or struggling can come for meals, conversation, connection. I want to build something my mother would be proud of. The silence on the other end stretched so long, Harrison worried he'd overstepped. She'd be so proud of you, Sarah finally said, her voice thick with emotion. The boy from Detroit who became a billionaire, who remembered how to be human. Over the following months, Harrison's life transformed in ways the business press couldn't understand. He made back most of the Shanghai losses through smart, measured investing, but he did it during normal business hours, leaving evenings for dinner parties, piano lessons, and volunteer work at the community kitchen he'd funded. The East Wing became exactly what he'd envisioned, a gathering place where his wealth created connection instead of isolation. Former executives sat beside struggling artists. Lonely widows shared recipes with ambitious entrepreneurs. And every Sunday, Harrison hosted a breakfast that grew from 12 to 20 to 50 people, all learning that community was the greatest investment of all. Sarah started her caregiving network with Harrison as her first volunteer. He'd visit elderly investors who'd lost spouses, young traders paralyzed by anxiety, anyone who needed reminding that success without connection was just expensive loneliness. "You're good at this." Sarah told him after he'd spent an afternoon teaching a grieving widower to play chopsticks. "I understand their pain," Harrison replied. "I lived it for too long." 18 months after Sarah first walked into his fortress, Harrison stood in his transformed home, now filled with laughter, music, and the beautiful chaos of human connection. His net worth had fluctuated, but his life had become infinitely richer. "Ready?" Sarah asked, adjusting his tie for the charity gala where he'd be announcing a new foundation in Eleanor's name. "Almost." Harrison pulled out a small velvet box. "There's one more transformation I'd like to make." Sarah's eyes widened as he opened it, revealing a simple ring, no massive diamond, just an elegant band that spoke of commitment rather than conquest. "I'm not good at this," Harrison admitted, taking her hand. "I'll probably mess up constantly. I'll get too focused on work sometimes. I'll try to solve problems with money when I should solve them with presence. But Sarah, you've taught me that the bravest thing we can do is let ourselves be truly known. And I want to spend my life being known by you, knowing you, building something real together. You're asking me to marry you. I'm asking if you'll keep teaching me to live. Keep calling me out when I build walls. Keep showing me that the greatest fortune isn't what we accumulate, but who we become." He smiled. "Also, I've gotten much better at cooking, so our meals will improve significantly." Sarah laughed through tears, pulling him close. Yes to all of it. They kissed in the foyer where she'd first challenged him, where she'd refused to accept his walls, where she'd seen through the billionaire to the broken man beneath. The evening gala was a triumph. Not because Harrison donated millions, though he did, but because he stood before New York's elite and told the truth about his journey from isolation to connection, from existing to living, from being a billionaire who had everything to being a man who finally understood what mattered. "My mother used to say that we're only as rich as the love we give." Harrison concluded his speech, finding Sarah's eyes in the crowd. "For too long I was a pauper pretending to be a king. Now, thanks to someone who refused to let me hide, I'm learning to be both wealthy and rich. And I invite all of you to join me in remembering that our greatest legacy isn't what we leave behind, but who we become along the way." The standing ovation washed over him, but Harrison barely noticed. He was too busy planning tomorrow's breakfast with Sarah, thinking about the piano lesson he'd scheduled with a young student from the community center, remembering that he'd promised to help Gerald learn to make bread. As they left the gala, walking hand in hand through Central Park, where his mother's ashes rested beneath her favorite flowers, Harrison realized that Sarah had been right about everything. Broken things could be fixed. Walls could become windows. And the boy from Detroit, who'd conquered Wall Street, could still learn that the greatest victory was simply learning to love and be loved in return. The city sparkled around them, not just with wealth, but with endless possibility. And Harrison Blackwood, billionaire, philanthropist, and most importantly, human being finally learning to live, walked toward his future with gratitude for the woman who'd changed everything by refusing to be fired for showing him kindness. In the end, it wasn't the 13th maid who changed the billionaire's life. It was the first person brave enough to see past his billions to the lonely man behind them, and patient enough to wait while he learned that the greatest transformation wasn't building an empire, it was building a life worth living. And they lived it, beautifully, imperfectly together, one sunset, one meal, one moment of genuine connection at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.